Be watching us another live stream with my dear comrade Sukant Chandan of the Malcolm X movement. If you enjoyed the last one, as we did get some very positive feedback from a number of people, if you enjoyed that, then we of course appreciate you sharing these links around while we're recording them live. Of course, sharing them after the fact as videos is also great. These are intended to not only let people into the kind of discussions that I have with Sukant and other comrades of mine, personally, and sort of bring that out into the public arena, but also as an attempt to really try to counter a lot of the misinformation and the disinformation that we find ourselves grappling with every single day, even on the left, even within the, sort of self created echo chambers that we all live in. We are being inundated with all kinds of discourse, and I think that it really is imperative for all of us to do the hard work of analysis, to work through all of the issues, to do so with an eye towards our politics and towards our ideas. This is something that Sukant and I were talking about a bit at the beginning of the last live stream. So with that, I'll just open it up to Sukant. You want to say anything before we jump into today's news stories that we want to cover?
No, it's good to be back. Welcome to all the listeners and the viewers, and let's roll.
Okay, so I guess we could begin by talking a little bit about the events that have unfolded over the last 48, 72 hours in Brazil. I would imagine everybody who is watching or listening to us probably already knows that there was a January 6th like incident in Brazil. That is to say, the storming by Bolsonaro's far right supporters, the storming of government buildings, the parliament building, etc. Very similar, eerily similar, according to many accounts, to what happened in Washington, D.C. with Trump supporters on January 6, 2021. The parallels and the echoes of those two are obvious, on the surface, but there's probably more to it that we need to discuss. So, Sukant, let me just open it up and ask you, give me your initial analysis, your initial read on what you saw on the videos coming out of Brazil, statements that we've heard, and of course, put that into a political context.
So I think I think we know now why Bolsonaro ran off to Miami. Pretty good move considering what has transpired. The left were claiming that, oh, he's ran away to Miami, like the right wing give up with their senior partners in leading Western states, not least Washington. So I think now, and it was a good move because obviously, he can't be arrested in Brazil. So there's this kind of, there's a bit of a blockage there in terms of holding him to account in terms of what's happened. I mean, there's some ridiculous side of it. The guy with the freedom guy in January the 6th with the horn and whatever, there's like his replica in the January the 8th now in Brasilia or wherever it was. So, so there is, it's ridiculous, but also it's explicit reference to a political behavior and a political reaction. I'm not saying, by the way, that Biden is Lula. I'm not making that parallel at all. So to be clear on that, but I mean, it's nothing new, is it? That right-wing grassroots in support of their leadership react when there's been some kind of a left or centre-left victory of sorts around an election, especially. So it's not particularly new, but also I think this is indicative as well, and we have to keep this in mind that Lula hasn't got the type of majority that he did when he was a president, 20 or so years ago, and he won by quite a slim margin. And obviously, I'm happy that he won by a relative slim margin than previous elections. But also, it indicates where history has gone since 20 years ago. That the right wing are emboldened, that the far right do have a bigger political community that is combative and that is confident. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and then I think we're going to probably perhaps talk about this more. But I think the reactions of global states and their leaders to this has been really interesting. Now, Brazil is a major economy in the world, not least of production of beef, of wood from the Amazon, on the global market and the regional market. So of course, all states will be looking to curry favor with the new administration of Lula. So they're all going to say, look, we support the legitimate government of Lula, etc., and we denounce this. The US government has said that, the UK government has said that, the Russian government have said that as well. And well, while they say that, we can probably guess that definitely in the context of the US government, there's probably some deeper involvement in what's happened here with the far right provocation in Brazil. But Putin's comment is Putin's statement is interesting, but then if you go back to how he's related to Bolsonaro and Lula is interesting. So I did a bit of quick research today in the lead up for this conversation. So he claimed that he has good relations with both Bolsonaro and Lula. And it made me think, like some global leader will say, I've got good relations with Pinochet and Allende. I'm friends with them both. I mean, what's the problem here? You know, I mean, it's a ridiculous statement in one sense. Now, I know he's trying to play a clever game there, but it's a bit of a pathetic game, because the supporters of Putin in Brazil are totally hostile to Lula, actually, and they are very much on the far right. So the New Resistance movement, which is a Duganist movement that's also in Brazil, totally hostile to Lula. And if a leader or if a political concept is saying, you know, you have this concept, there's no left and right, or I'm friends with both the left and the right. If you're friends with both the left and the right in a historical context where the right is in the ascendance and arguably perhaps even somewhat hegemonic in the world, well, you're feeding the right, not the left. So I think there's real problems around that issue when we come to this. But anyway, back to you.
Well, no, I wanted to just add the dimension that nothing that happens with the far right in Brazil should be seen as independent and specific to Brazil. It is an adjunct of a broader international network of far right allies, far right platforms, far right amplifiers, and far right conspiracies, dare I say, because I think it would be worth pointing out that Bolsonaro was elected in 2018 on the back of one of the most sophisticated and widespread disinformation operations using WhatsApp and messaging services to drum up insane ideas about Lula, about the left, about the Workers' Party and Dilma Rousseff and all kinds of things that were circulating at that time. And I think it's not a stretch to suggest that Bolsonaro is in many ways entirely a product of misinformation and disinformation. We know, of course, as has been reported by a number of excellent journalists, including my pal Mike Fox, who's been doing brilliant reporting from Brazil for years and years, that Steve Bannon himself was directly involved, and his close associates, along with Bolsonaro's sons. Again, another parallel with Trump. Bolsonaro's sons are active sort of political henchmen of the far right in Brazil, that Bannon was directly in touch with and probably, I think we could assume, directing much of what was happening to install Bolsonaro in power in the first place. And again, Bannon with regard to January 6th, and now Bannon with regard to what happened in Brazil. Bannon is calling these folks freedom fighters. Here's Bannon talking about those that won, or rather those that lost the election and stormed the Capitol, stormed the Parliament building as being freedom fighters. Gee, what does that remind you of, Sukant?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So right, so also just want to connect this to another thing that came out. So Bannon had this. Bannon and his colleagues had this war report program, and a colleague shared with me that Steve Bannon said that he met Alexander Dugin in Rome, and they had a 13-hour conversation, which is really interesting. And he was very positive about Dugin and his fourth political theory, or whatever it's called. But he warned Russia to not go into a deeper alliance with China, which also reflects Trump's strategy as well in relation to Russia and China. And it was widely reported that Trump tried to get his army to bomb China as one of his last acts in his presidency. And anyway, people can go and research that. But I think, yeah, this is really interesting. And Steve Bannon is very much the leader of the far right who wants confrontation. He absolutely organizes, and he's very explicit about this, be it on smaller levels of the far right groups in the US. He's just like, I think it says like, just go smash him in the face, I think it perhaps is a quote from Bannon. So he's very, very confrontational. And I think that kind of works for the right-wing project because they know they've got something there. Also, just an anecdote about what you mentioned about the disinformation campaign. Now, I know a colleague who's Brazilian, and she's very much on the left, and she flew back during the presidential campaign to ensure that her mother and her family voted for Lula and not Bolsonaro. So she comes from a historical left-wing family, but the family split on this, and she had to fly back to try and convince her family, like, look, we have to kind of stay the course and be loyal to this project going forward. So yeah.
I think that it's important to note, of course, that what we've seen in Brazil is very much part of the broader global far right. Call
Yeah.
it the fascist international, call it whatever you want to call it. But I think we have to place it into a context. There's a reason why Bolsonaro allied himself so closely with Trump, why their families are close, why you could find dozens of connections between the two. This is not in any way secret. It's been reported by many, many outlets. So think about what it means historically. What does it mean for Brazil's history, a country with the history of right-wing military dictatorship, a country with deep-seated far-right views on the institutional level, in the military, in the police, and elsewhere. In many ways, this could very well be seen as simply laying the groundwork for something in the future from the far right.
Yeah, I think so. And it's been widely commented, where were the security forces? Where was the military police? Where was other elements of the security state? There was a thin line of police, which again is kind of has kind of reverberations from January the 6th in the USA as well. I think they're very combative. I think the whole region has been, I mean, I was thinking about this. This whole region has been in the situation, what, since the Second World War, or even before, this kind of toing and froing within the shell of the actually existing economic order. You have this kind of reformist left-wing government, and then you have a reaction. I mean, yeah, to your point, Brazil had a dictatorship, what, for 2 decades, from 1964-65 until 1986. So that's a long period of right-wing dictatorship. Just by the by, the former vice president of the previous Lula administration, not this one, a previous one, Dilma Rousseff, was part of a leftist guerrilla movement as well in the underground, combating and resisting the military dictatorship as well. But at the same time, Latin America for me is one of the most interesting and diverse and vibrant regions of the world that has amazing kind of levels of grassroots movements from native peoples, from African diaspora, or African Brazilians, or Afro-Venezuelans, or Afro-Colombians, whatever you want to call them, of radical leftist movement, Guevarist movements. I mean, it's a really interesting region. But I'm just trying to think how the challenge is to kind of try and establish some kind of left-wing direction of longevity. And I'm not sure that that's really possible as we go forward, as the world crunches into a more right-wing situation.
Okay, yeah. Hey, good. Guess what? I figured out how to put the chat onto the screen. Isn't that
Oh, nice one.
amazing?
Big up,
I'm like,
Shushu Uchiha, great name. Fantastic.
yeah,
Big up. Big
thank
up.
you.
Keep up the good works. Thank you.
All right. So getting back to what you were talking about with regard to Latin America and talking about Brazil, obviously we could go for an hour just talking about Brazil. I would recommend people actually go to my Counterpunch Radio feed, the podcast Counterpunch Radio. You can go to the episode I did with Mike Fox, who's been reporting from Brazil. He's written extensively on it. He did the whole podcast, Brazil on Fire, covering all of this through the entire Bolsonaro presidency. I would highly recommend Mike Fox's work, my interview with him, and his podcast as well. But to your point, Sukant, about the sort of vibrant nature of politics in Latin America, and particularly some of the changes that have been I guess we could say, Latin America has undergone in recent months and in the last couple of years, probably no bigger, at least from the U.S. perspective, from the perspective of U.S. imperialism, than the attempts to undermine the Venezuelan government and to ultimately install a right-wing government in Venezuela that would be amenable to U.S. imperialism. Of course, I'm talking about Juan Guaido. I'm talking about the forces of the right wing in Venezuela, both the far right and the center right, that have for years done what they could in alliance with the United States and Spain and, right-wing Venezuelans in Florida and elsewhere to try to oust Maduro and the government of the Bolivarian state. Now, This is not to say that Maduro hasn't made any mistakes or that Maduro's great in every way, but we should be very clear. Guaido is a phenomenon of the right wing. The entire so-called opposition on the right in Venezuela is in varying degrees in bed with US imperialism. And so it is very interesting that now in the last couple of weeks, it has basically now been made official. Guaido is no more. The Venezuelan so-called interim government is no more. And Venezuela once again has only one government, and that is the elected government of Maduro and the Bolivarian state. Whether you like it or not, that is the reality. Sukant, your comments.
Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? So why has Guaido quit, given up? I mean, I think there's two factors at play, or several really. First of all, Colombia, the new administration in Colombia is not in collaboration with Guaido anymore, and hitherto it was. Actually, the new administration in Colombia is seeking to have peace negotiations with the ELN and the FARC. Caracas is directly facilitating that. The talks actually happening in Venezuela. After many years, the border between Venezuela and Colombia is now open. So Guaido can't use Colombia as a base for his project anymore. But also with the repercussions of the Russian aggression in Ukraine from last year, I think Venezuela has done the right thing to have a kind of a more non-aligned kind of strategy in terms of the energy industry in reaching out to Washington to say, hey, look, can we cut a deal now? So I think Guaido is just pushed out of the picture, literally pushed. What's the relevance of Guaido now in this? The Colombian flank is gone. The Brazilian flank is actually gone as well. And there's probably a little bit of a tenuous bridge being built between Caracas and Washington. So good, he's out. It's a relative victory. It's also a relative victory that the Bolivarian government has survived this long, actually, for decades now. That's good to see. I have a lot of criticisms, to be honest with you, with the Venezuelan leadership. Even in reflection and in hindsight, I think it's correct to critically assess even the Chavez period as well. But also in this period, and especially with the migrant issue, I'm very disappointed that there has been no leadership in the region that's really taken that by the horns and really try and use the politics and the very much humanitarian issue at the grassroots of the migrant issue to take a leadership on that and not allow the right just to constantly weaponize that and instrumentalize that for their project. So that's a criticism, but still, it's still an important, I say it's an important front. How many fronts do we have globally anymore? I'm struggling now to kind of answer that myself. But Cuba is still standing, although it kind of seems to play a less overtly political role after Fidel Castro and Raul, now with Canel. But yeah, I think good. Guaido has been defeated. That's a really important historical development. How can we build on that? I'm not sure, but we'll be seeing here on in what happens with this new kind of trilateral kind of alliance between Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil that I'm hopeful about.
Well, that's just the question, isn't it? I mean, to what extent is Guaido's ultimate downfall, at least in part, due to the rise of the organized left in Colombia? I mean, Guaido had so much in terms of financial networks and support coming from right-wing elements in Colombia and the the various right-wing elements in Florida. And I wonder if the new government in Colombia made it more difficult.
100%. It was. Listen, I remember there was one moment. I don't know. It was circa maybe 2009, 2010, maybe. Chavez had a big panic. He had a big panic, and he suddenly made a statement. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, long-standing radical leftist guerrilla movement, they must disarm now. They must disarm. And I think the reason why he probably said that was, I think he was nervous about a US provocation via the Colombian proxy, that the Colombian army might try a violent provocation along the border. And so suddenly he kind of stated that. But yeah, so I think that Colombia is gone. It's no longer going to serve that purpose. And the signs of what the Colombian government is trying to do are actually generally quite positive and good. However, go back to that critical kind of reflection, the Colombian state is not delinked from global imperialism. It's not. It's still embedded in that. We had the experience of what was it called? The Union Patriotica in the mid-80s in Colombia, where the FARC did disarm. They formed the political movement, the Patriotic Union. And how many thousands were killed? I think several thousand former guerrillas who entered in the political process were killed. And we have a similar kind of repeat pattern of that in the last several years with the peace agreements with the FARC that seen them disarm and demobilize and enter into these peace villages. Oh my goodness, it's where they're just being picked off. They've been picked off one by one by the right-wing death squads, which actually the current government is also in trying to have a peace process with I think the auto defense units they're called. So a lot of the FARC, many FARC, maybe not a lot, but many FARC are saying, look, we'd rather die with weapons in our hands than just be picked off in this little shack, with our vegetable and fruit garden surrounding it. So the situation is still tenuous going forward. I think for those of us on the left having these conversations, it's a balancing act from not being politically sectarian and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, while at the same time being critical minded and understanding what the limitations are in a framework of solidarity. And just the final point, when the NATO operation in Libya happened in 2011, that was a real sad moment when it comes to all of this politics. Fidel Castro was correct to ring the alarm bells, I think, in early March in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. He's saying, look, NATO's coming for Libya. He kind of sent out a message in so doing by saying that to the left, to say, look, mobilize another imperialist war. And Chavez said, it was a strange comment, I think he publicly said to Gaddafi, oh, come and have exile in Venezuela. But Gaddafi, it was a strange comment. Again, I don't know how useful that was really in that context. Gaddafi was like, I don't know what he said directly, but Gaddafi eventually said, look, I'm going to die on my own soil. I'm going to die on my kind of like ancestral land facing neo-colonialism. And that's what he did. But that moment again indicates the weakness at the height, arguably, of the global South kind of assertive center-left movement of Latin America and that alliance, that global alliance that Chavez led, which I think we need to critically assess and reflect upon. But when your closest ally is attacked in an open imperialist war and you can't defend them, then we need to think about, well, what needs to be put in place that we can actually confront that situation in a more functional way. But listen, what, 13 years have passed now, 13 years of defeats of the left, year upon year, month upon month, after a decade. So we're in an even weaker, even more precarious situation in the global situation than we were even in 2011. Yes, sorry, so you're correct, Tavish Hari. How you doing, bro? Yeah, you're right. Were Gaddafi, Chavez, and Evo Morales ever close to forming a SATO to combat NATO? No, nothing concretely happened. It seemed that there was a political agreement that they should form a global South military mutual defense pact. It didn't happen, and also the African Union collapsed around that war as well. So there's a lot of limitations here.
Before we move on from Latin America, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Peru, because not because necessarily we're going to be able to give insights that people that are there couldn't, but to place it into this broader regional context, as we were talking about, because again, we have seen what's happened in Peru happen in other places. So let's just talk through it. You had a leftist government elected. You had basically the grassroots, the indigenous groups, peasants organizations, others that had come out, voted in favor of the left. The left wins the election. And then for the next 18 months or so, and of course, I'm skipping over many, many nuances here, but we don't have a lot of time. Over the next 12, 18 months or so, it is nothing but standoff with the right-wing Congress. Eventually, the right-wing Congress pressures the president to cave to their demands. He disbands the Congress after several attempts by the Congress to remove him. He disbands the Congress, which I think many argue was probably him falling into their trap that they laid for him, because by attempting to disband the Congress, it gave them the justification to oust him via impeachment, which is what happened. Now, that's really kind of only the opening stages of this, though, because were it only the removal of the president, who, by the way, had a lot of conflicts. There were sectarian issues on the left. There were groups on the left that didn't agree with his policies, etc. So it was a complicated political dynamic. But were it simply the removal of the president, that would be one thing. But instead, what we've seen is an absolute explosion of the masses, of the grassroots all over the country, particularly among indigenous groups, as well as some of the trade unions, some of the lower end working class workers, lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, working class workers and so forth. We are now in a situation that is actually eerily reminiscent of what we saw several years ago in Bolivia, where we had a very similar situation where a right-wing basically a right-wing coup d'etat is backed by the United States, overthrows a left-wing government, and the people really come out and rally in support, create barricades, shut down the country, etc. Eventually, the right wing in Bolivia was ousted, and the left took its place in government. Similar trajectory, it looks like, in Peru. Of course, we don't know how it's going to end, but just this morning, Sukant, I didn't even put up the, did I put up the graphic? I didn't put up the graphic. Yes, that's from Jacobin, but there's been many other interviews and articles done about this. Just this morning, I was watching video on Twitter of Andean indigenous community that was moving massive boulders onto the roads to create these barricades and roadblocks in some key mining sectors and other areas of the country. So I say all of that because it's clear that what's happening in Peru is much more than just a political conflict at the top. And in many ways, it's reminiscent of several other episodes that we've seen in Latin America in recent years. So, Sukant, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so you have to forgive me. You'll understand what I'm about to say. Listen, I have a deep love in my heart for especially the Quechua oppressed people of Peru. They are, I mean, not only do they have a beautiful culture, as all of these grassroots communities do, absolutely. And yeah, absolutely, actually just total revolutionary salute to the people of Bolivia who defeated that right-wing government. That was a really ugly moment of that right-wing coup in Bolivia against Morales. Our comrades were really, they were basically lynched on the streets. It was horrific. And so it's a great victory to have overturned that. And now Peru, listen, Peru has got an amazing revolutionary history, as does Bolivia, as do all the regions of Latin America. But Peru, I think Tupac Amaru and Tupac Amaru II are sons of Peruvian people and land. It's had an amazing history. Now, look, Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, the Abimel Guzman-led Communist Party of Peru was very sectarian, made lots of political mistakes. However, it represented something very important at the grassroots, especially of the Quechua poor peasants. It represented their revolutionary war for the land and to overthrow the state. And there was strategic equilibrium in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken, where the revolutionary forces surrounded the capital and were seeking to overrun the capital. But that whole project collapsed, not least because of the violent political sectarianism, which was a major problem of the Shining Path. But also, in relation to that, the security state's dirty war against the people of Peru in that period was absolutely horrific, was really horrific. And similar to other states, we have to understand that Peru has a very nasty kind of military class and culture and history that can't be underestimated. Just a little kind of funny thing of history, what's his name? Fujimori ended up sharing a neighboring cell to Abimel Guzman, which was just a strange development of history, Abimel Guzman being the leader of Sendero Luminoso Shining Path, Peruvian Communist Party. So in Peru, what we're seeing now is inspiring. When the Colombian masses rose up just over a year ago, that was intense, amazing. Similarly, the uprisings in Argentina, including the Mapuche native resistance as well. This is really inspiring stuff. It's really good to see people mobilized, marching en masse from the left, from the radical left, from peasants' unions, etc. We need this imagery to inspire us. You know, we're desperate for it around the world. Similarly, the Indian farmer, similarly, the Sri Lankan uprising as well. These are things that help to kind of galvanize and help us in our advocacy as well. So there's 50 major transport infrastructure blockades by the resistance in Peru currently. It's no small matter. This is big. The country, as the South African revolutionaries said, they've made the country ungovernable.
It's general strike. They're in conditions of general strike, just as I mentioned in Bolivia a couple of years ago. Same.
It's really inspiring, and at the moment, the right-wing forces don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. You just
I don't think that they expected this. You know,
No,
I think they
I didn't
expected a
expect this.
backlash. They expected a backlash. They expected some street protests, but I don't think they expected the whole country to be shut down. I certainly don't think that they expected the trade unions and some of the indigenous groups to come out as quickly and in such an organized manner. So, yeah, inspiring to say the least.
Yeah, you see, my hunch is this: the Peruvian people have had several experiences of a taste of serious mass resistance, militant resistance. That's been brutally crushed, be it the Shining Path, be it the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Armed Forces, the MRTA, and other armed groups, and other non-armed groups. When people have a taste of resistance, and then they see someone with all the dysfunctionalities and the problems, a president and an administration that is engaging on some level constructively with their class interests. I think they felt that, and I think they want that, and they want to continue with that project, and they're willing to really go out. I mean, I think dozens have been killed in these protests. They're not going to stop. It's clear they're not going to stop. And just for me, you know, as we discussed in our previous video, and our shared principles, ethics, and politics, this is what it's all about. It's about the poorest being organized and fighting back as best as they can by any means necessary, willing to sacrifice and take those risks. You know, if they win or they're not, is not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is to try, is to attempt, is to be audacious, right? What did Lenin say? You know, who dares wins, right? And I wish the Peruvian masses all the best. And you know, all the nasty brothers in the positive way are all absolutely in the struggle. And of course, they're trying to generalize and criminalize and demonize the whole protest of like, oh, Sendero infiltration, etc., as happens, you know, as is usual with right-wing attempts to kind of neutralize this and kind of, you know, kind of brainwash people out of it. But I don't think it's going to stop in Peru, you know, so it'll be very, very interesting to see where things go. But are we just going to do this every 5 or 10 years? Is this going to be the cycle and the cycle and the cycle? We have a taste of something and then we got pushed back and massacred and then we push again. I mean, we need to kind of really kind of, you know, just take total control, take state power. We have to advocate that. It doesn't matter how bad things are politically, how defeated we think our politics is, we still got to state the truth, you know, the state. We have to capture the state. Well, actually, we have to smash the state and form a people's state, you know.
So I just want to give you a chance, Sukant, to make any other comments that you want to make about Latin America before we shift over to talking a little bit about Ukraine and the European Union and some other issues related to that. So anything else you want to touch on in Latin America?
No, I mean, I mean, yeah, I could talk, you know, for ages about different aspects of the region, but really, I go back to the migration issue. It's just sad for me to see human caravans, you know, traversing from South America to Central to the border with the USA, and it's, you know, it's good that, you know, there's, you know, people just spontaneously at the grassroots are supporting these caravans and these people, which are not just Latin American people, by the way. There's also Asians in that, because you can fly visa-free to Quito in Ecuador, the capital of Ecuador. And then you got Nepalis, Bangladeshis, you got Indians. They're all like going through this horrific route. They're being kidnapped, they're being killed, they're being kidnapped for ransom, they're being raped. We need leadership around this. You know, it's really important. I need to research into more. Is EZLN, are they providing any kind of leadership around this, around Chiapas and their regions of influence? I don't know. It's a major issue, and I think some of our leadership actually are just they know it's a major issue and they're just leaning away from it, which is just really sad to see. So I would like to see more focus actually on that. And if they actually took leadership on that, then I think it would inspire people, it would inform people politically on one of the most central issues of the global working classes. And also I think it will help to actually radicalize politics in a good direction as well.
All right, let's shift gears in the last 25 minutes here and talk a little bit about, well, Ukraine, but more broadly, issues related to Russia, Ukraine, the war, Eastern Europe, Europe. Specifically, I want to start off by talking a little bit about Hungary. Hungary has played such an interesting role since Russia's invasion in February of last year. Hungary has tried, I guess you could say, to kind of walk a line between maintaining its obvious alliance with the European Union. It is a EU member, etc., while continuing with this sort of favored economic relationship with Russia, both in terms of energy, but other factors as well. This has, of course, created, as you might imagine, created a tremendous amount of friction between the Hungarian government, and especially Orban, and the Ukrainian government, specifically Zelensky, but also the European Union. I think it's important to note that Orban was the major, stick in the mud when it came to the EU sanctions packages. Each and every round of sanctions had to go through Orban, whose government basically watered them down and watered them down and watered them down in order to exempt things like Russian energy through pipelines and other economic necessities for Hungary. I think the other story that I would just highlight as I try to paint a broader picture about Orban and Hungary is that there are several levels of tensions between Hungary and Ukraine. Obviously, Hungary's continued watering down of the sanctions and continued somewhat pro-Moscow orientation has been a problem. But there are other factors as well. Zelensky's government has made moves that I would argue are tremendous blunders, tremendous mistakes in regard to basically, I don't want to say criminalizing, but basically legally establishing Ukrainian as the language to be used, the language of instruction in schools, the language for business to be conducted and state business and so forth. This creates obvious problems for those that are not native Ukrainian speakers that are inside of Ukraine. Now, the linguistic issue, of course, always comes up when you deal with Russia's propaganda about Donbass, about Russian speakers, about the nature of Russia's ethnic and linguistic ties to Donetsk, Lugansk, etc., Crimea, of course, as well. But it is not only Russian that plays into this issue. Hungarian is also, as well as Romanian, both have minority status inside of Ukraine, both have enclaves in Ukraine of Romanian speakers, Hungarian speakers, etc. And this sort of relegation of Hungarian to the secondary status for those communities is a major source of tension between Ukraine and Hungary. So, and that's one of probably several others that I'm not even going to go into right now. So, the role of Orban in the context of the war in Ukraine, and also the role of what you might call these sort of Ukrainian nationalistic policies in exacerbating some of these divisions. I think we all can understand some of the logic behind Ukrainians trying to establish Ukrainian as the language and pushing out the languages of the former colonial master in the case of Russia and the former imperial masters of Polish, Lithuania, et cetera, right? We could go on and on about the history. The point here is, in my view, Zelensky making a tremendous mistake, caving to a right-wing Ukrainian nationalist orientation in order to then continue building his own base of support. But Sukant, let me get your reactions to some of the things I laid out.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. You know, it's a complex situation. It's divided the left. I think that's quite healthy, actually, the division of the left around the Ukraine conflict.
Oh, thank God.
But yeah, I mean, it's not going to do. I mean, it's a really sad situation because obviously Ukraine and Ukrainians have been subjected to this supremacist war where the warmongers bombing their civilian infrastructure, occupying them, annexing their territory, are arguing that Ukraine doesn't exist and Ukrainians don't exist. So the response to that on some levels is inevitably going to be the bolstering of an ultra-nationalist right in Ukraine. You can see that in relation to the resistance to the Russians in Ukraine, that it's helping to kind of like really strengthen and embolden things like, you know, I know the Putin camp like to only bang on about this, and that's all they can particularly see is the Azov battalion. You know, so but the politics of the Azov, you know, obviously it's going to grow in this context, and I agree with this. It's a mistake to start then discriminating against Hungarian communities there, Romanian communities there, and also in the kind of hierarchy. I would assume that the Hungarian and Romanian communities in Ukraine are not as privileged as other communities there as well. So again, why target people in that way? And if you've got the moral high ground, which they do, they're the invaded community, they're the occupied community, they're the community suffering annexation and aggression. If you've got the moral high ground, then why throw it away by this? But anyway, I'm agreeing with what you argued. The person of Orban is really, really interesting to me, because, as you say, he's leader of Hungary, which is part of the European Union. But the bridge that is embodied in the person of Orban between the Western far right and the Eastern far right is just fascinating. Yes. And for those who claim there is no joint enterprise between the Eastern far right and the Western far right, just go listen to Orban's speeches. Just look at where didn't he go to that crazy Trumpist Republican conference just several months ago? He spoke there, you know. So here you are, close ally of Putin, in close alliance with Trump as well. It's there. It's right.
And the leading U.S. propagandist, Tucker Carlson, who did a whole multi-part series about his, you know, trips with Orban and, you know, whatever. I mean, Tucker is not to be underestimated. He is the leading fascist mouthpiece in the United States. He is the Father Coughlin of our era, and I think we should be mindful of just how important he is.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also, Orban's politics, oh my God. It's like, you know, what does he say? He said in a recent speech in 2022, he said what? He said, "We are not a mongrel people.
Yes.
We are not a mixed people."
Outright Nazi language from Orban. It caused some of his closest allies for years to resign from his government. I believe one of his closest advisors, who had been with him from the beginning, resigned and was like, "I'm not going to support this kind of fascist propaganda." So, you know,
he's you know, he's a snowflake. He's a triggered snowflake on the far right who's absolutely obsessed with trans people, absolutely obsessed with gay people in the most negative, ridiculous way, absolutely obsessed with trying to double down on a ridiculously falsely constructed whiteness and white supremacy. Hungarians, white? Are you sure? Are you really sure?
Sukant, do you remember back in the day when we were first encountering this red-brown nonsense, and one of their leading people at the time described Orban as the Chavez of Europe? Do you remember Orban, the Chavez of Europe?
That was from someone who calls himself a Marxist-Leninist but espoused just explicitly neo-Nazi politics. But you know, so edgy, huh? So edgy. Wow, you're in alliance with far-right politics and far-right people. Ooh, what does that do for you? Whatever. But back to Orban. I mean, Hungarian people obviously are historically mixed people. They are, like every people in the world, are a quote-unquote mongrel people, a mixed people. The fascists and the Nazis always use this mongrel thing to try. It's a strange kind of like reverse engineering of like opposition to white supremacy. So, but they're saying we can't be dehumanized into non-whiteness. We are white. So it's just so bonkers and crazy. I'm surprised there's not more opposition to Orban on the left, but perhaps it's just been kind of compromised with all of this mess of this red-brown confusions and stuff. But the central thing I want to say is people have to understand, or in the political body and leadership of Orban is very much, he is the fusion of Eastern West far right politics, and he's not an insignificant European leader. You know, he's actually, because of all of this politics, playing a quite an important role for himself, and he's been treated with great respect, relatively, by the European Union. You would have thought they'll say, look, you can F off, mate, you know, expel, get him out, you know. I mean, they won't treat him like they treated Greece, for example, are they, you know, with the Syriza government. Hey, remember them? Remember that great hope of the left, Syriza in Greece? Maybe another time we'll go into that and the limitations of that. So,
but doesn't that say more about the European Union, about the fact that there is no mechanism for removing Hungary from the European Union, the fact that Orban has managed to essentially leverage the entire political situation to his own benefit, much like Erdogan? I would say Orban and Erdogan are probably the two most deft political operators that we see right now, at least on the chessboard in Europe.
I think you know, Brussels is making the correct decision for themselves. Is rather keep them in than keep them out. You know, it's same as Erdogan. Rather, you know, Erdogan plays a much more important role than even Orban for
No
Western
question.
imperialist global politics. You know,
No question.
relatively Orban is a two-bit player compared to Erdogan and his regime. But yeah, it's similar dynamics in what you've shared, which is correct. Which is like, well, these guys. I mean, in the case of Turkey, I know. Sorry, I'm digressing and kind of diverting into that, but I think it's just incredibly. It's incredible how Erdogan has managed to market himself in such a successful way, considering how steeped in supremacist blood, literally, he is, not least in the situation with the oppression of the Kurds, occupying northern Iraq, occupying northern Syria. Basically, you know, his proxy forces are deeply embedded and involved in Libya as well. His role in the conflicts in Syria and in Libya, facilitating many more than tens of thousands of recruits for armed supremacist gangs and militias who have looted, raped, and injured and killed in these conflicts. But yeah, so back to Orban, I think it's just much more useful for the European Union to have someone who aligns himself so closely to Putin, but is in the European Union. I think it actually serves some useful purposes for Brussels in that regard as well. To have that type of element in the European Union in some ways and shape or form. But what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with you in one sense. I mean, it really depends on what the goal is here. I mean, if the goal was to really cripple Russia with these sanctions, then they absolutely failed because Orban outmaneuvered them. Orban needed the exceptions, he needed the exemptions, and he needed the Russian energy to keep flowing, or else he would be facing potentially a political crisis of his own. So he prioritized what he needed, and he basically remained obstinate with the Europeans. Now, from the broader perspective, I do agree with you in terms of the, you know, call it the political chessboard here. To make Orban into an enemy probably would have been a worse scenario for Europe than it is to have, you know, the enemy, I guess, in your house, or however, whatever metaphor you want to use. But unfortunately, as far as I know, and I mean, I do have a couple of friends that live in Hungary, so I should probably be speaking with them about this. But as far as I know, there really is no significant political alternative to Orban now or at any point in the immediate future. And so, given that, I mean, I think it makes sense to try to control him as much as possible from the European perspective. But anyway, there's much more we could say about that. But in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to shift a little bit and talk about Ukraine and talk about the question of imperialism, neocolonialism, etc. Right? There's a lot of talk on the left from people who don't know shit about shit, who say that Russia is just merely fighting against NATO. Russia doesn't want anything but to fight back the West, to fight back NATO, to push back the US imperialists. And frankly, Ukraine is not even really a thing, if you know what I mean, right? So this is, of course, this is actually supremacist talk. This is actually denialism of the worst kind. It's anti-communist, it's anti-socialist, it's anti-internationalist. It's not the left, right? This is the kind of stuff you hear from the red brown. And what you find is that when you look at their analysis, whether it's from the soft part of that crowd, those who simply stand on their laurels of peace and their white doves and say, we must negotiate immediately. Who cares about the situation? It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is negotiation, which, by the way, benefits one side, but let's not talk about that. But anyway, that's all that matters is negotiation, right? This is not an imperialist war. There's nothing, not a whiff of imperialism and neocolonialism and imperial revanchism in this war. Not a whiff. Oops. Putin ally fighting to control salt and gypsum mines near Ukraine city of Bakhmut. Okay. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It came from US intelligence. So obviously it's a lie. Obviously this is totally untrue. And there are perfectly reasonable strategic explanations for why the Russians would send hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fighters to their death to take a town that means nothing strategically, right? It means nothing strategically. This is clear. And yet, why are Wagner dying in their hundreds? Why are Russian military dying over there? It is to steal resources. As I've said many times before, those elements on the left that choose to selectively point to only one aspect of this war, which is NATO and the role of the United States and the West broadly over the last 30 years, and totally ignore the dozens of other elements of this war, including the intra-oligarch conflicts, including the desire to secure the agricultural output and the arable farmland, including the desire to oust the Ukrainian oligarchs and to steal their wealth, including the desire to take over the infrastructure, including the desire to remake the map and to essentially roll back 100 years of history in the entire Soviet Union, right? None of that matters. Only NATO matters. Right, Sukant?
Yeah, just to our friend Forky who's commenting, I'd like to refer him back to our previous live of the previous week to go through that. And also the YouTube channel Prolocult has done a really good documentary about the Ukraine war. And directly to your point, yeah, absolutely. How can we suggest that a gangster capitalist state, which is Russia, is engaged in a major military conflict and commitment that has no economic interests? I mean, it's just silly stuff, you know? But that's exactly how the pro-Putin camp framed this. This is some kind of culture war, actually, in defense of their constructed ethnic Russian community in the East, right? So it's a beautiful savior war. It's just a war to save people, you know?
Oh, thank God. Thank God for that. I'm so relieved that this is a war to save people.
Grozin, Wagner, the entire, Russian ruling class, they're all vested. It's just silly stuff. We have to be serious. And if it's come to a point where people think that, Putin is engaged in just some kind of like, saving his diasporic, putting all in inverted commas, his diasporic Russian community in the East, they really need to go check themselves. It's just silly stuff. Go back to the drawing board or shut the hell up. It's you're not in the conversation because you're not bringing anything to the conversation except total. I mean, what are the adjectives you can even use around this? What is it? It's just like a conceited ignorance that you're spouting around. It's just nah. But yeah, that was really interesting. But yeah, it's of course Eastern Ukraine is just so rich in resources and industrial and agricultural infrastructure. It helps to literally feed the world. Along with other major states, Russian production as well of grains as well. It's a major producer of sunflower oil, of other agricultural products, of fertilizer. I mean, I think people kind of have realized this, and who couldn't realize it? The people of the global south realized, because like, oh, there's no bread coming. Oh, there's no cooking oil coming. Why? Because there's this conflict in Ukraine. And then I know some of my long-standing colleagues were in total denial about this, but Putin has weaponized all of that very openly, and negatively impacted people. This is a nasty, dirty war, and like every nasty, dirty war, including the neo-Nazis, and I think the original Nazis of Hitler, and I think there is actually some parallels here with that, because they're the major. That was the only other major kind of advanced state that colonized, occupied, invaded, bombed, and annexed in the Lebensraum the living space. Germans need living space, etc. And I think Putin is actually doing something very similar in a similar framework. But yeah, it's rolling on. Putin's going to escalate. Belarus are going to enter, as they have done anyway at the beginning of the war. It's going to get more brutal. Putin has nowhere to go in how he's positioned himself, but to escalate here. So let's see what happens next. But it's not good news.
Well, the good news is that we can pretty much stop the war now because Ukraine doesn't actually exist. Did you know that, Sukant? Are you aware that Ukraine doesn't really exist? That it's just a construct of the United States? It's not a real country. It doesn't have real people. They're merely puppets of Washington, of Biden, of those people, right? I mean, this is the kind of language you hear from many on the left. There is no character to this war other than proxy war. That is all it is. That is the only way it should be understood. And you should believe that because I am a serious leftist. So say the Red Browners. Now, here's my former comrade, Ajamu Baraka, talking exactly in this language. Folks, in the name of peace, we can't continue to pretend that something called the Ukrainian nation and state with independence and sovereignty actually exists. Ukraine lost its independence in February of 2014. The U.S. then reduced the nation to cannon fodder for U.S. strategic interests. Well, that is extremely convenient for somebody continually justifying Russia's supremacist war of destruction to say, actually, it's okay because Ukraine doesn't really exist. And oh, by the way, I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, and there's not a single Ukrainian that you will find that's actually going to agree with that statement. Not a one.
Yeah, well said. And, greetings to sweet Uncle Ajamu Baraka. How you doing? So he presents his supremacist framework there. So I think this is really interesting, and I've engaged several comrades this last week since our last live, actually, on this specific issue. Thank you. Just to remind viewers of the poetry that emanates from Uncle Ajamu.
Oh yeah, you gotta love it. Completely denying an entire nation its existence, right? Without any actual analysis to back that up, of course.
I've directly invited Uncle Ajamu onto a live with me to have it out with me, and let's go through it. Come on, let's go through it, Ajamu. Let's go through it. Vijay Prashad, where you at? Come on, I'm happy to go through it with you. Fellow Indian communist like you, brother, comrade Vijay, both aligned family members to the CPM in India. Come on, let's talk about it. They won't. I hope they will, but I don't think they will. So I've discussed this with several comrades. We've debated this in the last week since our last live. So I've said, they said similarly to Uncle Ajamu. After 2014, basically it becomes like a colony of U.S. imperialism, right? I said okay. I said yes, there was definitely a shift from in 2014. There was a political shift, of course there was in Kiev. They did become more pro-Western. Than hitherto. I think it was Poroshenko regime until then.
Yanukovych is toppled in 2014, replaced by temporarily Yatsenyuk, etc., and then eventually Poroshenko in the first election.
Thanks. And so, but what is the answer to that then? Is the answer to that a supremacist war of collective punishment of civilians? I mean, come on, this becomes ridiculous again. It's if you let things slide like this, you enter into the realms of just total irrationality and things that just don't make sense. So when has the left response been to a rightward shift of a state to say, no, another superpower needs to go in and bomb the hell out of all the civilians, occupy them, recruit conscripts with no training, throw them there to rape and injure and torture, and then to annex territory? It's never been a part of the left lexicon. It's never been a part of leftist culture, history, ideology. None of that, actually.
That's what happens when you get in bed with fascists, man. That's what happens. The fascist outlook normalizes and takes on a left veneer.
Stockholm syndrome. Too much. Get out of it. It's a choice that you're making, guys, to embed yourself so deeply, psychologically, and financially into that racket. There's no, there's just no, what can I say? It's ridiculous. Our answer is not supremacism and supremacist war and collective punishment. It's none of that. And then obviously, working back from that, they have to construct all these falsehoods. There's Russians in the east of Ukraine. Well, it's more complicated than that. And even if there was, is that the answer? Is that what we do? And then we discussed this in part in our previous. But then you go, and then you try to understand, well, where does this political culture actually come from? What is the roots of this political culture on the left? Because to be honest, it doesn't just exist post 1991. In world politics, it has a much longer trajectory. The red brownism itself, I mean, the brown shirts was a part of that. The workerist movement of the National Socialists, the Nazis, it was there, and it's even before that. So it has a long history. This it's just what's happened in the last 2 to 3 decades. It's become the dominant force in what used to be anti-imperialist politics.
Right. What used to be. Yep.
Yeah. So what used to be. So, I've been on the World Federation of Democratic Youth World Conferences of WFDY, the youth festivals. I've been to one in Cuba, one in Algeria, went to Cuba in 1997, went to the Algeria one in 2001. Both fantastic experiences. I was there as in my late teens in Cuba in 97. In my early 20s in 01, just a few weeks before 9/11. Anyway, I can tell you lots of stories about that, but that's when still things were not as bad as they were. But looking back on it, you could see all of this coming way back then as well. And I've had these conversations with my other colleague here, Dan Glazebrook, about it just yesterday evening. We're constantly reflecting upon this and where this came from, as well the infiltration of these ideas in the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s into the new millennium. It was there. That was the kind of the last hurrah, a lot in terms of the radical leftism in these kind of anti-capitalist movements. But even the term anti-globalization, it actually does feed into this stuff as well. So then the right wing infiltrated and said, look, the globalists are the problem. I mean, where does the term globalist come from? It's not in Marxism. Lenin never talked about the globalists. And just the last point is that Lenin and Ukraine. Go back and research Lenin and Ukraine. As we said previously as well. So when they claim that post 2014 Ukraine isn't really Ukraine, it's some kind of just construct of the Yanks that needs to be obliterated by means of a supremacist war. No, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to this.
They're also promoting an explicitly genocidal attempt here in this war. This is genocidal, and I don't mean genocidal in the sense that it's the only mass killing that we've ever seen. I mean, it's genocidal according to the textbook definition of the word. It is an attempt to eradicate the very concept of Ukraine itself, of Ukrainians in general. According to Putin and his anti-communist and anti-Lenin speech that he gave and many other references that he's made in the past, basically Ukraine does not exist, and to the extent that it does exist, it is only the west of Ukraine. The ultra-right nationalist elements in Ukraine around the city of Lviv and elsewhere, that is Ukraine, and everything else is Russia. Right? In other words, Ukraine doesn't exist. So when you see a Jamu making a comment like that, and I don't normally try to single people out, but I thought a Jamu's tweet really encapsulated many of the arguments that you find here, where they completely deny not only the political character of the state, not only the nature of the war itself, the events on the ground, they deny everything about the reality of the conflict. They deny the nature of the resistance, they deny the nature of the motivations for the war, and they deny their own complicity in it. And this is part of the problem that we have to be open and honest about, is that there are people that are unwilling to accept the very basic premise that the people of Ukraine have a right to resist an invasion by their colonial masters, their historic colonial masters. If you can't accept that, or if you find some kind of justifications or pretzel twisting gymnastics in your mind to find a way not to support that, well, that's what we're talking about. That's where you collaborate with the fash. It is the fascists internationally that are of that opinion, that are supportive of Putin, that love the anti-gay, woke rhetoric that Putin spouts, that the far right spouts. That's what they're in bed with. That's what a Jamu really promotes and popularizes with a tweet like that. The idea not only that Ukraine doesn't exist, but Putin is right.
Yeah, just a recent development as well in regards to this. So the new far right government in Israel, Netanyahu, I think it's the Ben Gavir, his name is, made some statements. So they've shifted position towards Russia now, where they were just, where Putin was kind of, where the Russian leadership were dissatisfied with Israel's kind of relating to that, and they were a little bit leaning towards Kiev. Now there seems to be leaning back towards Moscow in relation to that conflict. But another interesting thing in the mix in all of this, which is central as well. So there was a senior former IDF intelligence officer who has stated in the media that the recent Israeli bombing of Damascus airport in Syria was facilitated by the Russians. And then we can go back on the timeline in the Syria conflict of the nearly the 2 weekly Israeli bombing runs on Syria, which people widely know that Russia was protecting and facilitating and make happen. So there is a mirror imaging between Israel and Russia when it comes to Ukraine, because both are involved in a supremacist colonizing, annexing project. Tel Aviv, particularly in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and Russia in the theater of Ukraine. So there is this symbiosis and this solidarity between two very similar frameworks there.
Yeah, and more to the point, I mean, the bottom line is there is not a single Ukrainian voice or Russian anti-war voice on the left that you will find anywhere that's going to agree with that. It is only Russian ultranationalists, Putinists, red browners, fascists around the world that will agree with that. Now, we can make all kinds of criticisms of the Ukrainian government, as I have.
With that, what, sorry?
I'm sorry?
You saying agree with that? What is that, sorry?
Well, that would agree with the idea that Ukraine doesn't really exist, that Ukraine is just a construct, and et cetera, right? That it is the far right internationally that would agree with that would agree with Putin. And so, again, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that there is a consensus on the far right about Ukraine. More to the point, to deny the nature of the war in Ukraine, I say again, what other context would you be able to provide, or another example you could provide, where leftists in the West are 100% in opposition to every leftist in the country in question? I know of literally one Ukrainian who has written one article that kind of, sort of, aligns with Russia a little bit, right? I have seen hundreds of articles written by Ukrainians, Russians, many others in the Russian diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora, all over the world, who oppose all of this. I don't know of a single Ukrainian voice other than the one I referenced, who is very odd himself. I don't know of anybody who agrees with any of what the red brown folks say. So why does that matter? Well, because we don't live in Ukraine. We don't live in Russia. I think it's important from an internationalist perspective to say, you know what, we have comrades internationally, and we should probably listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, I agree. Listen to the peripheralized, oppressed minorities being forcibly conscripted into the war in Russia as well. They're complaining all the time on the front lines, you know?
Every day you see new videos of people from Dagestan or from Buryatia or from some other region in Russia.
8,000 kilometers away towards the Pacific. And what we're doing here, we're just poor people from Yakutia being thrown into this nonsense. Where is the, I mean, with the red browners, I mean, again, the left wing and the red browners, where is your voice? That's what I'm saying. They've shut down themselves on so many issues, not only directly related to Ukraine, but also other related issues as well. We can, by the way, that camp has split over the Andrew Tate issue. Sorry, I know this is a little bit ridiculous comparatively to what we've discussed. But when Samira Khan, on the one hand, who is she used to have a show on Russia Today, she has a defense campaign for Andrew Tate in alliance with the Afghan Taliban defending Andrew Tate. This gets so ridiculous. Then you've got Maram Susli, Mimi Lahan, Syrian partisan girl, very prominent English language advocate for the Syrian government, who's attacking Samira Khan and saying, no, Andrew Tate is not our comrade. And then she writes, this is so funny, she writes in the Sun newspaper in Britain, which is the most infamous, trashy, racist, sleazy newspaper in this country. Some funny stuff. Anyway, that's
Well, the
relatively
Assad, the
compared to what we talked
pro-Assad,
about.
the hardcore pro-Assad camp is full of this kind of red, brown, fash stuff. It's part of the reason why you and I extricated ourselves from any relations with any of those type of people. So that's that. We'll have to leave it there. We will do another one of these soon, I'm sure. Malcolm X Movement on Twitter. That's where you should go to follow Sukant. You can follow me on Counterpunch Radio is the podcast. Of course, the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, and the YouTube channel and everywhere else. Thanks, everybody. We will talk again next time.